been looking at some of my favorite sermons. We've been using the COVID crisis and the fact that we have to do a lot of our church over electronic and internet means. So we've been looking at some of our favorite sermons. Last week we talked about Mama's Chicken. And while Mama's Chicken is a parable, the sermon I'm going to do today is my absolute favorite sermon of all time. It's not the first sermon I ever preached, but it's one of them. I was 18 years old the first time I did this sermon. I will admit openly that I took the exegesis, or the Bible study portion, almost directly from Major Jeff Ryan. I had just come back from a conference where he had spoken, and I had spent the entire summer in southern Africa, and really God changed my life in some amazing ways while I was in South Africa. So where Mama's Chicken is all made up, it's a story, it's a parable meant to tell a point. The stories that I share in this particular sermon are all real. Now, it changes every time I give it, depending on the circumstance. And the reason for that is because I talk about the problems all around us, the problems in our world today. The first time I shared this sermon was coming back from Southern Africa, and I was asked to speak at a missions conference, or a Salvation Army missions event for the state of Massachusetts. And I was a little overwhelmed, and I had just heard this, so I used the exegesis and the Bible study, but I inputted my own experiences from that previous summer. I've used the sermon immediately following 9/11. I used the sermon following all kinds of different events. When I was a camp director, I would give it every summer, right before we went into battle, as I would call it. And I would use stories that directly related to child abuse. Obviously not with the actual names, but real events that were a part of my life in that people and experiences that had been shared with me. It's a real thing. All of the stories are real, and so when I've shown emotion during this sermon, even staring at a camera I might, because it's hard. We live in a really tough world, where there's real, genuine evil all around us. And having faith requires, I believe, that we intellectually delve into what it means to live in a broken, hurting, fallen world, and what our response is supposed to be. And that's really what this sermon is. Even though I change a lot of the stories from time to time, so if you've heard it before, you may have heard it with different stories. I usually start with the same one. I tell people about how I met the girl of my dreams. And she was beautiful. She had the most soft skin, the most beautiful blue-gray eyes that I've ever seen. I've never, to this day, I haven't seen anyone else with the same shade of blue-gray. They kind of stare right into your soul. She had the softest, dirty blonde hair. Her name was Lucinda. Now, those of you who know me know that my wife is Delia. Lucinda was the girl of my dreams. My wife is the woman of my dreams. I had just gotten to South Africa, and we were in Etembeni, which in Zulu means a place of hope. And it was an orphanage, it is to this day an orphanage for children with AIDS, children who are HIV positive. And even though those children may test negative, because the tests they use are for the antibodies, which a child born is born with her mom or his mom's antibodies, when they're born, they may convert, but they spend the rest of their life labeled as AIDS babies, and they may never see anywhere outside of an institution. And though in many countries like ours, there are drugs available now that can bring the viral load down to undetectable. When I was there, the most that they were able to give the children are multivitamins, because the cost just wasn't available. And even though some of those drugs were already available, they just weren't widely spread. And so Lucinda had just arrived before me. She had been found out next to a dumpster. And she was approximately 8 weeks old. They didn't know because they found her. There's no papers left next to her in the dumpster. And Lucinda was my dream girl. I looked at this girl, and at 18 years old, I saw her as my child. I would go in every day, and most of my team would go to all the toddler rooms where they could play with the kids, and the kids would play back, and I would help the two caretakers in there, and they were making fun of me in Zulu, and I didn't learn that till about the third day. They said every time a group comes, one person, usually a woman, would go into the infant room with them, and they would help, and they would fall in love with one kid. And that's exactly what I did. Lucinda was my kid. In my mind, she was my baby. And I sat there, and we would change 20 babies with cloth diapers. And I got pretty good at it. We would change 20 babies, then we would feed 20 babies, then we would change them all over again, then we would put them all down, and they would go to sleep. It was a pretty good cycle. But once all the work was done, I'd run over to Lucinda's crib, and I'd pull her out, and I'd hold her there until the cycle would start all over again in a couple of hours. And I'd just sit there staring into those blue-gray eyes and scheme about how when I got back to the States, I was going to sell everything I possibly had and move to South Africa and find a way to adopt and raise this baby as my own. I was 18 years old. And I never moved to South Africa because by the time we left, Lucinda had died. She was gone. And that broke my heart. And it made me ask hard questions because, I was born with a bad heart. I was born with actually 2 heart problems, and one I found out later on, and I've had multiple heart surgeries. And my sister was also born with a bad heart, and she was born with bad lungs, and she was told she was not going to live past the age of 12 that no one ever had. And you know what? She's now got 3 kids of her own because the doctors invented a surgery just for her. And I had to ask, why is it that I get born with problems, my sister gets born with problems, and they can invent new technology just to save my sister, and yet this little girl dies, never has a chance. Well, I got back to the States, and I moved on. I didn't necessarily get the answers I wanted for my questions right away, but I moved on and continued to live and try to serve God the best I could, even though at that point in my life I had some unanswered questions. And next came Karina. Now, Karina wasn't a baby. Karina was preteen, I believe, when we first met her. She's from Puerto Rico, and her dad was a professor, and her mom was a nurse. And they were playing in the ocean one day, and her leg just snapped. She had a rare kind of cancer. And so we were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where my parents were serving as ministers at the time with the Salvation Army. And that's when Karina and her family came into our life. And Karina was beautiful too. Not like Lucinda, because Karina was a teenager. But she wasn't that kind of beautiful that causes other girls to get catty, you know what I mean. She was the different beautiful. She was that beautiful that everyone wanted to be around. Girls, guys, everything. She just brought around, uplifted everybody. She was that girl next door, that just wonderful, kind of glowing personality. Karina lost her hair, like many people with cancer, but she had this beautiful smile. And then they removed her leg. And they replaced the bone with the bone of a cadaver, but she still wasn't able to walk on it. And then she lost her weight. She became gaunt. That smile wouldn't go away. I remember one of the last times I went to visit her with my dad. It was just me and him, and she looked up at my dad, who would visit her often and visit the family often, and she looked at her dad, who was stricken, and she looked at my dad, and she said, "Make him laugh. Make him smile." And that was the last time I ever saw Lucinda smile. And even as a teenager, I asked myself, why, God? Why would this girl who had all kinds of opportunity, who had all kinds of future in sports, we'd say she had upside, she had a whole life in front of her. Why? And I didn't get an answer yet. And it frustrated me. And all these years later, after preaching this sermon over and over again in so many circumstances, sometimes I'm still tempted to ask why. Right now we're in Corona. We're in a lockdown. People are losing jobs. People are losing livelihood. People are losing their lives, let's be honest. This is what it's really about, isn't it? People are getting sick and dying, and everyone's frustrated, and everyone has an answer, but then no one's really sure what's going on because this is happening around the world. And some people are saying we should go back to work because people are losing their jobs, and other people are saying no, we should stay home because people are getting sick. And they're all right. Everyone is right and everyone is wrong at the same time. It's a time of confusion. And we still have to ask why. Why? Well, I'll tell you why, and I find it in the book of Psalms of all places. See, this psalm was written, Psalm 144, by David. He was king at this point. And David would look at the world and he asked questions of his kingdom and of the world around him. And David lived in a world that wasn't what it should be, but he had a vision of a reality of what it could be. You see, that's why I spend the time feeding people and giving out food, and that's why my wife goes visiting from family to family, and she spends all this time working and making sure that everyone has what they need, and that's why we fight. Let me share with you this vision that David had. He says, our sons in their youth will be like well-nurtured plants. Our daughters will be like pillars carved to adorn a palace. Our barns will be filled with every kind of provision. Our sheep will increase by the thousands, by the tens of thousands in the field. Our oxen will draw heavy loads. There will be no breaching of walls, no going into captivity, not even in our own homes, hiding from a virus that we can't see but certainly can feel when it attacks. No cries of distress in our streets. Blessed are the people of whom this is true. Blessed are the people whose God is the Lord. So my question would be the same as David's, though. How do we get to this reality, this vision that David had of his people, of his country, of his world, where this would happen? Where little girls like Karina and Lucinda get to grow up. They get to go to their first prom. They get to find that husband and be walked down the aisle. How do we get to a place where people are fed and they have the food that they need to survive? Where they're not desperate for groceries that just a few weeks ago were plentiful, and now even with the money, they don't have, the grocery stores don't have the food. You know, when I've preached this before, I would point out that the number of people that would die in the time that it took me to preach it from hunger and hunger-related disease. But the fact is that I have no clue right now because of the effect of Corona and the lack of food and the scarcity going on around the world and all the different additional problems happening. I couldn't even fathom it. But even before this happened, it was up in the 6,000s people in just an hour would die from hunger and hunger-related diseases. That could be double. I'll tell you, if we continue at the rate that we're serving people here at the Salvation Army in Niagara Falls, I will have served more food boxes in the month of April than in the entire year of 2019. Most of them are people who have never come to a food pantry in their life, never needed to ask for help. They're embarrassed, uncomfortable, but their hunger and their fear for their family outweighs all of that. So how do we get to the reality of food, sheep by the tens of thousands in the field, and no cries of distress, and no fear of where our next meal or where our next grocery bag is coming from the reality that we live in? Well, the key to this psalm is at the beginning. Psalm 144, and I'm looking at verses 1 and 2. And I read, "Praise be to the Lord my God, my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. He is my loving God and my fortress. You see, we have to be ready to fight. We call ourselves a Salvation Army, and it's not because we're out there fighting in a physical way and putting our lives on the line. I shared a meal yesterday at a socially safe distance with a friend of mine who is a drill sergeant, and I told him, I said, we don't put our lives on the line the same way you did, or do, because he's still active. I said, but we do fight. We fight in a very different way. God calls us all to step up. Whether you wear a uniform like this or whether you don't, if you're a follower of God, then He calls you to commit yourself to the battle. We read in Corinthians, all of creation is calling it to be, is being reconciled. And you know, we're instruments of that reconciliation. God uses us if we respond to Him in love. So this afternoon, this evening, this morning, depending on when you're watching this, God's calling you to respond to Him in love. And I would encourage you to pray and figure out what He's calling you to do. How is He calling you to serve? So as you consider this, I would pray that you would respond in love to God. That you would armor up, soldier up. Soldier up for this fight. God bless you. Be with you.